Hello, I am Adriana Sabino, the president of the Centro Cultural Brasil USA da Florida, CCBU, and the curator of Flip Miami. I am pleased to introduce to you the panelists who will discuss translating Brazilian prose and poetry, Machado de Assis, Ana Cristina César, Ana Martins Marques. Elisa Vuk Almino is a writer, translator, and editor based in Los Angeles. She has translated Ana Cristina, among others, as well as poetry collection titled This House by Ana Maria Martins Marques. She is the editor of the book Alice Turnbull Mason, Pioneer of American Abstraction, published by Rizzoli. She's a senior editor at Hyperallergic. Her essays about art and literature have been published in important journals and magazines. Flora Thompson DeVoe is a translator, writer, and researcher who studied Spanish and Portuguese at Princeton and earned a PhD in Portuguese and Brazilian Studies from Brown University. She translated the works of several Brazilian authors. Her writing has appeared in Brazilian magazines. Her recent translation of Machado de Assis, The Posthumous Memoirs of Brás Cubas, in Penguin 2020, has been celebrated as a gift to scholars. Flora lives in Rio de Janeiro, where she is Director of Research for Rádio Novelo. The conversation will be moderated by Dr. Patricia Lino. She was born in Portugal. She is the assistant professor of Luso-Brazilian literature and cinema at UCLA. She's also a writer and poet. Patricia presented, published, and exhibited essays, poems, and illustrations in more than 6 countries. Her current research focuses on contemporary poetry, visual and audiovisual culture, parody and anti-colonialism, and Brazilian film. Ladies, I wish you a wonderful panel.
Thank you.
Adriana.
Thanks for that introduction.
Yes, thank you so much. So welcome to the panel 7, translating Brazilian prose and poetry, Machado de Assis, Ana Cristina César, and Ana Martins Marques. Today I have the enormous pleasure to be so well accompanied by 2 talented translators, Elisa Calmino and Flora Thompson DeVoe. I think we will begin by hearing Elisa and then Flora, and then I will open the space for discussion. I have a few questions for you prepared, and then we can read also the questions of the audience. Elisa?
Wonderful, thank you. It's really a pleasure to be here. So today I'm going to talk about 2 different poets that I translate, and my approach and relationship to translating each of them is quite different. And I think it's interesting to talk about how a given author or a given piece of writing can completely transform the way you think about and pursue translation. So I'll start by talking about Ana Martins Marques, who's a contemporary poet from Belo Horizonte in Brazil. She was born in 1977, and I believe she is in the audience today, which is amazing. And she is the author of 6 beautiful poetry collections. She's also the first poet I ever translated. I had just graduated college and I was reading this magazine based out of Rio called Piauí, and I came across this poem about a person's relationship to their umbrella. And this symbiotic relationship of walking with an umbrella above your head with its ribs opened and it following you around wherever you go. And Ana describes it as what must be a form of happiness. And the poem ends tragically with the familiar act of forgetting the umbrella at a cafe. And this lovely ending just really captures Ana's sense of humor, and the poem is also just really emblematic in the sense that it conveys the emotional life of an everyday object. And so after I read this poem, I was totally enchanted, and I emailed Ana directly, and we started a conversation. And she sent me her books. She sent me suggestions for poems I might want to translate, but she always stressed that I should translate whichever poems spoke to me personally. And over time, this has become a very important thing for me to be able to connect with the poems that I'm translating with, that I can see them happening in English, right? And I'm lucky to have that trusting relationship with Anna. So after publishing a few translations in journals and magazines, an editor of a small independent publisher called Scrambler Books based out of Sacramento reached out to me and asked me if I wanted to do a book with them on my translations. And I suggested Ana Martins Marques. And the publisher gave me a lot of freedom to kind of do whatever I wanted. And in brainstorming the book, I decided not to choose an existing collection of Anna's poems, but rather to do my own selection of her works. And I chose a theme that's very prevalent across all of her books, which is this fascination for domestic objects and our relationships to them. So poems about a fork, a knife, a sink, a clock, a bed, a desk, so on. And my perspective as a translator is that, you know, I'm translating in a way to engage with my Brazilian home. And so I liked this idea of building a bilingual imaginary home that exists in both Portuguese and English. And so I titled the book This House. And it's also a phrase that's taken from a poem of Anna's called Cliffs. And like most poetry collections, we have the benefit of it being bilingual, so you get to see it in both Portuguese and English. And the publisher also had this amazing idea. So I illustrated the book as well, which was fun. And the publisher had this idea to mirror the images on each side. So you have the two images sort of in opposite directions, which I loved because the images are similar but different, as in the actual poems, right? The Portuguese and the English are similar but different. So this mirroring effect that happens in the book that I quite love. So I'm going to just read two poems from this collection. I'm going to read the shortest poem and then the longest poem. But don't worry, it's not too long. And I think they show different aspects of Anna's poetry. The first one is very pithy and you'll see. So I'll read it first in Portuguese just so you can get a sense. Piscina. Ó mar, eu também não sei onde começo. Pool. Oh, ocean, I don't know where I begin either. And then the next poem that I'm going to read is one that I find that people really connect with. And it's also a poem that, the first poem of hers that I ever published in translation, and therefore the first poem I ever published in translation, period. So it's very near and dear to my heart. And it's called Clock. What would be the use of a clock? If we wash white clothes, it's day. Dark clothes, it's night. If you part an orange with a knife in two, day. If you open with your fingers a ripe fig, night. If we spill water, day. If we overturn wine, night. When we hear the toaster's alarm or the kettle like a small animal that would try to sing, day. When we open certain slow books and maintain them alight at the expense of alcohol, cigarettes, silence, night. If we sweeten the tea, day. If we don't sweeten it, night. If we sweep the house or wax it, day. If we wipe damp cloths on it, night. If we have migraines, eczemas, allergies, day. If we have fever, cramps, swellings, night. Aspirins, x-rays, urine test, day. Bandages, compresses, ointments, night. If I heat in bain-marie the honey that crystallized, or use lemons to clean the glass, day. If, after eating apples, I keep on a whim the dark purple paper, night. If I beat the egg whites, day. If I cook large beets, night. If we write with pencil on lined paper, day. If we fold the sheets or crease them, night. Expansions and peaks, day. Layers and folds, night. If you forget in the oven a yellow cake, day. If you leave the water to boil alone, night. If through the window the ocean is quiet, sluggish, and greasy like a puddle of oil, day. If it is furious, foaming like a rabid dog, night. If a penguin reaches Ipanema and lying itself on the hot sand, senses its icy heart boiling, day. If a whale runs aground during low tide and dies heavy, dark, as in an opera, singing, night. If you slowly unbutton your white shirt, day. If we undress with anxiety, creating around us an ardent circle of cloths, night. If a green, brilliant beetle beats repetitively against the glass, day. If a bee circles the room, disoriented by sex, night. What would be the use of a clock? So next I'm going to transition to talking about Anna Cristina Cezar, who is the other poet I've been translating. And in fact, earlier I was talking about how it's important to me to be able to choose which poems I translate because sometimes I don't see them happening in English. And in fact, one poem that I really tried translating but gave up on is a poem that Ana Martins Marques wrote in honor of Ana Cristina Cezar. And it's a poem called Self-Safari Letter for Ana C. And I wanted to translate it very much because it showed a connection between these two poets I'm translating. But unfortunately for me, the poem has a lot of wordplay with their shared common name, Ana, throughout the poem. And I couldn't find a solution in English. So I gave up on that. But it serves as a transition to Ana Cristina Cezar, who is known for having a big impact on this newer generation of poets in Brazil, including Ana Martins Marques. Ana Cristina was born in 1952. She died very young at the age of 31 by suicide in 1983. And she's a very well-known poet with a huge cult following in Brazil. She wrote poetry in the 1970s and early 80s in Rio de Janeiro, where she's from. And one of the reasons why she's so popular is because she was one of the first Brazilian poets to really write about the everyday life of women. And even though she didn't claim to be a feminist, she's considered to kind of have paved the path for a lot of feminist poets in Brazil. Her writing was very audacious, not just in its content, but in its form. So they're shaped more like letters and diary entries. And the books that I'm focusing right now on translating are called Kid Gloves from 1980, which is a book of prose poetry, and The Complete Correspondence from 1979, which is in fact just one fictional letter, 3 pages long. I am also translating a selection of her actual letters that she addressed to my mother. The two of them knew each other when they were in their late 20s, early 30s, living in Europe. Anna was studying translation. My mom was studying art. And I had known about their friendship for many years, but it wasn't until 2 years ago that my mother handed me this stack of letters, which is a total treasure trove. But what was most incredible to discover among these letters was that Ana Cristina had written an early draft of one of her books, Kid Gloves, in the form of a letter to my mother. And this was fantastic because it really illustrated how her poetry grew out of her letters and her letters grew out of her poetry. So whereas with Ana Martins Marques, as a translator, I'm very focused on bringing her images to life and kind of focusing on the imagery in her poems. Whereas with Ana Cristina, it's really about this voice that imitated letter writing, that imitated diary entries, and this voice that was colloquial, but also literary and erudite. And it's a very a tricky balance to strike. So that's where my mind has been as a translator. Another difference is that in the case of Ana Cristina, she is not living. So I cannot ask her questions, whereas with Ana Martins, I have that wonderful opportunity to be able to just shoot her an email, right? So instead, I find myself relying on these letters in a way, like what secret do you hold for me as a translator, right? And I also have my mother, who has been indispensable to my translation and who in fact was a big influence on Ana Cristina when she was writing the book that I'm translating, because it includes a lot of allusions to the drawings my mother was making at the time and just little bits of imagery that I think I wouldn't have picked up on if I didn't have my mother and didn't know that they had this friendship, which is in fact a very special thing. So to close my little presentation today, I'm going to just read a passage from my translation of this book called Kid Gloves. It's a passage that was recently published this month in Circumference magazine and excerpted on Literary Hub. And it is the epilogue of the book. So the very last few pages of the book. And it's a section that has, it's a little bit more performative in tone than the rest of the book, I would say. And it describes the narrator opening a suitcase packed with postcards from around the world. And the scene, very much recalls Ana Cristina's own life of travel and her obsession of corresponding with friends, including all the letters that I have in my possession. I'll just read an excerpt of the epilogue. And the first few lines are actually maintained in Portuguese. So I can explain why later if we want. Epilogue. No minuto vou passar para vocês vários cartões postais belos e brilhantes. I'm going to pass around in a minute some lovely glossy blue picture postcards. This is the leather suitcase that contains the famous collection. Notice my hands, empty. My pockets are also empty. My hat is also empty. Look, my sleeves. I turn my back, I spin completely around. As all can see, there is no trick, no hidden trapdoor, nor any deceiving light games. The suitcase rests on this chair here. I open the suitcase with this master key in ceremonies like this, if you allow me such a game. The first thing we find in the suitcase, on top of everything, is, guess, a pair of gloves. Here they are, kid gloves, a fine thing. I put on the gloves, left hand, right hand, perfect cut. That reminds me, a young artist lost in the elegant Berlin of the Belle Epoque, alone, looking in vain for pleasure. A clamorous group of skaters pass by and a woman in white drops her glove, a glove with 6 padded buttons, white, long, perfumed. The young man runs, picks up the glove, but reluctant as to whether he should accept the challenge or not. In the end, he decides to ignore it, keeps the glove in his pocket, and goes back walking to his hotel through poorly illuminated streets. But I'm digressing from my purpose tonight. Later, if there is time, I will conclude this fantastic story in which even a Neptune carriage, a giant bat that smiles and always runs away, and an ocean of foliage make a cameo. Who knows if this is not exactly that glove? However, we don't have just one here, but the pair. It's very delicate and contrasts with this black suit. Will the leather valise contain various toiletries? No, my friends. As all can see, by gently rotating the chair on which it rests, the valise only contains paper, cards, dozens, maybe hundreds of postcards. Strange valise. And now, attention. With my gloved hands, one moment while I button up one of them, and then the other, carefully. There's no trickery here. I adjust my wrists like this. Now, with these hands at random, I pick the first postcard, which I contemplate for a moment under the light. Thank you, obrigada. That's it for me.
Thank you so much, Elisa. Flore?
Thanks, Elisa. Just thinking about the movement of the wrist. How long did you spend in front of the mirror thinking about what would be the precise, because that's part of the translation. As you read, you provided an additional element. And I thought it was a very good translation. Well, I wish I could have a little list of whoever's in attendance now and whoever will watch this later, because Machado de Assis is a writer who, for Brazilians, needs absolutely no introduction, and for non-Portuguese speakers needs a heck of an introduction. So it's a strange position to be in. But I wanted to talk a little bit about sort of the expectations or reverence and irreverence, perhaps, because Machado de Assis is one of the big names, if not the big name, in Brazilian literature, despite, they're telling me mostly Brazilians in the audience. So I will cut this short. But I think that it's, I wanted to reflect a little on the experience of reading something canonical. So when you know that something, when you're approaching something as a classic, when you know that something is important, how do you approach it? And my experience with reading, first reading Memórias Póstumas Brás Cubas, which I later came to translate, was just this vague understanding that it was an important book. You know, I was a sophomore in college. I was in my second year of Portuguese, and it was in an attempt to sort of get more serious about my understanding of Brazilian literature that I got myself a copy, this cheap Scholastic copy, and I sat down with it. But it was in the sense of more like, I'm taking my vitamins. I am I am doing the thing that one is supposed to do, which is not necessarily the way that we sit down to really enjoy ourselves with a book. And so it was a wonderful surprise when I found myself just being completely knocked off kilter and entertained in ways that I didn't think I would be, because this is at once a canonical work and a very funny work and a very profoundly irreverent work, which I think that, it's interesting to reflect on the effect that this has, consciously or subconsciously on the rest of Brazilian literature. The fact that this book, which is, enshrined in all of the pantheons of Brazilian literature, is a book that is so contrary to the idea of pantheons, that is so sort of destructive and corrosive. And often it's enshrined and it's people pay tribute to it in a way that the text itself sort of contradicts and deauthorizes. So anyway, my first impression on reading was like, first, I love this book, and second, what sort of a classic is this? If you first have this impression of this book cannot possibly have been written in 1880, 1881. And then as I got to know it better, I came to the conclusion that it could only have been written in 1880, 1881, because it's a book that's actually profoundly inserted in its context. But I won't go into too much detail. I'll just have to say that in this interaction between reverence and irreverence, I read the book with a sort of vague understanding that it was important, and I was pleasantly surprised. By the time I came to translate it, I had been studying Machado de Assis. I'd been studying his works for years. I was starting my program in grad school, and so I had acquired the thing that I didn't have when I first read the book, which is this tremendous reverence for Machado de Assis, for his works. And so I had to sort of peel the egg, get back to the first point, that raw first contact with the book, because otherwise I don't think I would have been able to translate a single joke. You have to respect it. I have to respect the text, but you're not going to get past the 5th page if you can't let your guard down and allow yourself to really play along with the book. So I think that sort of dialectic sums up a lot of my relationship to Machado de Assis, and certainly to the posthumous memoirs of Brás Cubas. And when I was flipping through the translation, thinking about what to read, I wound up settling on one of the first chapters, which it's a book that catches you off guard from the start, because it's the posthumous memoirs. First of all, what is that? And then it's the posthumous memoirs of a person you've never heard of. And then you sort of ask, should I have heard this person? And then you realize that they're not the memoirs that were published posthumously. They're memoirs that were written by a dead man from the grave. So things have already gotten really weird in the first 3 pages. And then he keeps taking it up several notches. So he tells you a little bit about himself, about his funeral, the normal preamble for a dead man. And then he just starts messing with the reader somewhat mercilessly. So I thought I'd read one of these first chapters where he really just, shows you what you're in for, which is chapter 4, The Fixed Idea. My idea, after all its somersaults, had become a fixed idea. God save you, reader, from a fixed idea. Better a mote in your eye, or even a beam. Look at Cavour. It was the fixed idea of Italian unity that killed him. It's true that Bismarck hasn't died, but it must be said that nature is a fickle maid and history is an inveterate flirt. For example, Suetonius gave us Claudius, who was a simpleton, or a pumpkinhead, as Seneca called him, and a Titus who was deservedly the delight of Rome. Recently, a professor has come along and found a way to show that of the two Caesars, the truly delightful one was Seneca's Pumpkinhead. And you, Madame Lucrezia, the flower of the Borgias, while a poet painted you as a Catholic Messalina, along came a skeptical Gregorovius to wash away a great deal of that depiction. And while you may not have come out as a lily, neither were you left a swamp. I shall let myself stand somewhere between the poet and the scholar. Long live history, then, voluble history which can go every which way. And returning to fixed ideas, I shall say that they are what makes strong men and madmen. Wandering, vague, or shimmering ideas make for Claudius's, in Suetonius's version, that is. My idea was fixed as nothing comes to mind that is quite so fixed in this world. Perhaps the moon, perhaps the pyramids of Egypt, perhaps the late German diet. The reader may pick the analogy that suits him the best. Go on, pick one, and don't get your nose out of joint just because we still haven't arrived at the narrative part of these memoirs. That is where we're headed. I do believe that you prefer anecdotes to meditations, like all the other readers, your comrades, and I believe you do well to prefer them. Well, that is where we are headed. Nevertheless, it should be said that this book is written unhurriedly, at the pace of a man no longer burdened by the brevity of the age. It is a supinely philosophical work, but of an inconstant philosophy, first austere, and then just as quickly playful, one that neither edifies nor destroys, neither inflames nor chills, and is nevertheless more than a pastime and less than apostolate. All right, straighten out your nose and let us get back to the plaster. We shall leave history with her elegant lady's whims. None of us ever waged the Battle of Salamis or wrote the Augsburg Confession. For my part, if Cromwell ever comes to mind, it is only to think that His Highness, with the same hand that locked the doors of Parliament, might have forced the Bras Cubas plaster on the English. Do not laugh at the joint triumph of pharmacy and Puritanism. Who does not know that at the foot of every large, public, prominent flag, there are often a number of other, more modestly proportioned flags, which are hoisted and flutter in the shadow of their larger counterpart, and which quite often survive it? To offer a poor analogy, it is like the rabble, sheltered in the shadow of the feudal castle. The castle fell and the rabble remained. Indeed, they became grand in their own right, a veritable stronghold. No, the analogy is really no good. Thus ends chapter 4.
Thank you so much. Wonderful to hear you. I guess I can begin by asking my questions, and then I will read eventually when they arrive the questions of the audience. So my first question, since the title of this panel has these two words, prose and poetry, I wanted to ask you, Elisa, you translate poetry, right? Mainly poetry, and Flora, you translate mainly prose. Why? How did you choose to do that? Did you think about it? And what is the difference, you would say, between translating prose and translating poetry?
Well, I have always been a big reader of poetry since a young age. And when I moved to Miami, 14 years old from Brazil, I remember that my parents would give me poetry collections by Brazilian authors, and I very much devoured them. I loved reading Brazilian poetry, and I think the first poet who really marked me, or one of the first, was Paulo Leminski. And he is also another poet that I started translating. So I was foremost a reader of poetry. And then I started to pursue writing and my own career, and but not as a poet. I'm not a poet. Though I definitely, wrote poetry in high school, like, we all write poetry in high school, but, I'm not a poet. But I mainly write essays. But I think that it was a way for me to engage with this writing that I loved so deeply. and a way of writing it too, a way of writing poetry too. So yeah, what's interesting though is that now I'm translating Ana Cristina César, who wrote prose poetry. And she, in a letter to my mom, wrote that she walks the tightrope of between like prose and poetry. Like she's always kind of like unsure of what it is she's writing, and she had aspirations for writing a novel actually. And I guess when I think about even my approach in translating something that's a little bit more prosy, I find myself wanting everything to be clear. Whereas with poetry, I more readily accept this ambiguity that happens. I'm like, I accept it. Whereas when I'm translating something that's a little bit more prose, I fight more with the paragraphs. I'm like, this needs to make sense. I don't understand it, and yeah. So that's an impulse that I'm currently fighting and grappling with. Yeah.
I don't know. It's funny because one of the few poets who I've actually translated is Ana Martins Marques. So I don't know what that says cosmically about us, about Elisa and I, about Ana Martins anyway. But in general, I really do feel more at home in prose, and part of that I think is because I don't read as much poetry, and I certainly also have not written poetry of my own free will after high school. I think there's something that I identify with, particularly in the sort of sprawling, many-voiced nature of the novel, that it's at once something that has so many different faces and also a self-contained universe that has its own rules. And so the challenge of stretching, people often think of the difficulty of translating poetry and that you have so little room to maneuver. But the challenge with a novel is systematizing sort of this whole universe. And I think I'm drawn to that in the sense of creating what may be often an invisible order. You might not notice that you almost certainly will not notice that I used the same adjective on page 17 and on page 237. But, there's something that appeals to me profoundly in that.
Thank you. And in another question, both of you seem not to be able to separate love and translation, because when you are speaking, you repeatedly say, I fell in love with Machado, I fell in love with Ana Martins Marques, and then I decided to translate this author. How would you describe your process of translating a text? How is your method? Is a chaotic method? Is a very organized method? And how the process of loving the author develops throughout the process of translating? How does that work for you?
Geez, I would say that, well, first, love is the precondition for translation for me. I mean, there are translations. I'm a professional translator, and so I've translated many things that I did not fall in love with. But when it comes to the literary translations, the things that I really consciously choose, it's almost, it's not like a relationship, because I think I would compare, just sitting down with a book and reading it as sort of feeling your way into a relationship. But then translation, I feel like there's something like a marriage contract, because if you're going to translate something, if you feel, well, first there's the urge to do a translation, which sometimes doesn't even make sense. Sometimes I'll be reading something that has no conceivable audience in English, and yet I want to translate it. So there's some sort of chemistry that happens with the text. But one of my principal criterion for the work that I was going to translate over the course of my dissertation is that it would be a book that I would not get sick of for years on end. And so that's why I compare it to a marriage. I mean, you can't, these are translations that you can't rush. And and you can't get sick of the thing. You know, Machado is a writer who always surprises me, who I can always find different and new and, you know, shocking things in at every paragraph. And now I'm really in a bind because I have this peculiar taste. You know, this translation was unexpectedly successful, and now I feel this pressure to come up with something that will be as adored. And I'm almost, you know, I'm almost swearing chastity and saying that, you know, there's no other novel for me like Brás Cubas, and in a way there isn't. But certainly a precondition for translation is, at least a translation on this scale, is a work in which you can sense depths, but it's beyond that. This is something that I'm wrestling with on a daily basis, so forgive the prolix answer, but beyond that, there's a very specific connection with your sensibility. So there are many works where I would think, you know, I would love to write a paper about this, but I wouldn't want to translate it, whether either it's too painful to inhabit for prolonged periods, or you just feel that while it's profoundly interesting, it's not something that you would want to dive into. And then there are the works that you just feel like you've made a friend. And sometimes that list makes absolutely no sense when you put the works together. You know, you wouldn't be able to find rhyme or reason, but, you know, the common thread is, you know, just getting along with the work, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, I love that, getting along with the work. Yeah, I mean, as I said before, it's become very important for me to be able to choose what I'm going to translate, that I feel like I can connect with it. And actually, when I think about, to go back to the first question of prose versus poetry, I mean, sometimes I think about how with a novel, if you're committed to it, you have to translate every single page, every single line. You can't just be like, oh, nah, I don't really want to do that page, right? Whereas, sure, poetry has its own set of challenges, but I do get to, if I'm doing like a selection or something like that, I do get to be like, okay, I don't think I can envision this one happening, so I can skip it, right? But yeah, I think you also used another important word, Flauta, which is a chemistry, right? You need to have chemistry with the poetry you pick. And I'm really obsessed with this book called This Little Art by Kate Briggs, in which she talks about, it's a book basically all about love and the love of a translator. And she talks about how part of the love of translating is wanting to rewrite a text and putting it into words, right? And I think that is a very pleasurable experience to do that. And that's definitely a part of my process. In terms of like my translation process and how I sit with something, I mean, when I teach translation, I generally do advise people to pick an author that you're familiar with, who you've really already like devoured and you've read everything of theirs and you're very immersed, right? Because it will not only make you a better translator, but it will show you how much you connect with this person, and you know, you'll discover a lot of things in the process. So I'd say that's my step one, is just reading as much as I can by the author before I dive into a translation. Yeah, and I don't know how much detail you want about process, but we could really just do a whole session just on that, but I'll stop there.
I imagine that the process is also related with the author you choose to translate, because I imagine that the process is not always the same. And my next question, oh wait, I guess I have a question from the audience. What do you consider to be the hallmarks of a successful translation? How do you decide that you want to translate a work? From Silvia Sabino.
The hallmarks of a successful translation. I mean, there's so many different ways to measure success, right? And one thing that I've been thinking a lot about is that a successful translation depends, we always put the greatest burden on the translator and on the publisher, but there's also the extent to which the reading public is prepared to receive the work. And I think a lot about that in the context of the previous translations of Machado in the 50s and then in the 90s. And it's not that it's not that my translation is leaps and bounds better than those, by no means. But there's something of, are people going to be open to this kind of prose? Are people going to be looking for this kind of prose? And this is something that we face as a particular difficulty in the English-speaking publishing world with the, it's a tiny fraction of, people are not accustomed to reading fiction and translation. They see it as something sort of disagreeable, an inferior product. Whereas when I came to Brazil, I was pleasantly surprised. Well, I was both surprised and chagrined, because we walk into a bookstore and then there's, universal literature, there's French literature, Portuguese literature, and then the Brazilian literature shelf is often the smallest. And then in the American bookstores, it's the exact opposite. So you can have a translation that is in, almost all respects successful, aesthetically and, in terms of context and, and still doesn't manage to reach a wide public. And that's I would say that's often the case, unfortunately. And the other part of the question was how you choose to translate a work.
Yes, how do you decide that you want to translate a work?
Yeah, I think for me that happens. It's almost like an itch when you're reading, and maybe I don't know how much of that is a desire to make the words your own. And that's why I say that sometimes this happens with books where it doesn't even make sense to translate it, but you just there's a feeling of kinship that bells up, and then the decision to try to make that commercially viable often doesn't depend on you. You might try and you might not be able to get it published, but for me it's a consequence of the act of reading. And I think of the 18th century habit of copying out and memorizing favorite texts. People would have these lengthy quotations by heart, and they would have journals and journals of excerpts from their favorite works. And to me there's something similar in the feeling of connection and wanting to keep it for yourself in a very granular way. For me, the decision to translate is something that just sort of it wells up during the reading, and then you can you decide what to do with it.
I just want to tell you that we have 4 minutes only, unfortunately, only 4 minutes.
Okay. Yeah, in terms of how to tell if this is a good translation, which is a question that comes up a lot when, translators complain that book reviewers never talk about the translation of a book, really. Now increasingly they do, but for a while it was just like elegantly translated, moving on, and the debate is like, how do we know? Like, how do we talk about what is a good translation, right? And for a long time, the phrase was, you can tell it's a good translation if you can't tell it was translated, right? And we translators don't like that because it erases our work, but also that's not always a measure of whether it's good or not, right? Sometimes a very good translation can draw attention to itself in interesting ways and keep, foreign words and do all sorts of things and be like a very intelligent translation, right? So you don't always want it to be the seamless experience that's, catered to an American audience, right? That isn't necessarily always a good thing. And then when I talk about, how can I tell if it's a good translation? I think it's the same as how can you tell if it's a good piece of writing? Is it an exciting piece of writing to you? Is it evocative? Is it challenging? Is it, anything that you would describe in terms of a good piece of writing applies to that's the translation, right? The translation is the writing that you're reading. So I think that's part of the conversation when we're talking about what makes a good translation. And then in terms of how to choose, we talked about the love, our personal love. And especially for me, I definitely think translation is not my full-time job. It's something I it's part of what I do, but it's not the only thing I do. And I generally pick authors that I connect with and love. But another important question that comes up is, you know, what voices do I want to add? Who hasn't been translated yet? You know, what aren't publishers looking at? What image of Brazil do I want to bring? Or, you know, there are just so many layers to that question that are often quite political too in our choices as translators.
Thank you, Flora. Thank you, Elisa. I'm told that we have 1 minute. I'm so sad because I had so many other questions. But Adriana, please.
I also had questions, but I think we don't have time anymore. I had a big one, but I will leave for another opportunity. I thank you so much, Elisa Vulcalmino, Flora Thompson-DeVoe, and Patricia Lino for participating at the first Literary Festival of Miami, FLI Miami. I think you were a wonderful addition to our program, and you added a very important element. You added that bridge. The translator works as a bridge between two cultures, two languages. And this is the spirit of FLI Miami. And I think you did a wonderful job. Thank you so much.
Thank you for the invitation.
Thank you.
And the program continues now with Cristóvão Tesa, and then after Nélida Pinhon. So keep here with us.